All right, so we'll get started with today's conversation. My name is Mary Lee Demmer, and I will serve as your moderator today. On behalf of the Student Affairs Assessment Leaders Professional Development Committee, I thank you for participating in today's structured conversation. I also want to thank Dr. Gavin Henning, Dr. Joanne Prosser, Dr. Jody Fissler, and Dr. Karen Solomon for joining us today to share their expertise on accreditation and assessment with us today. As well as Shelley Pleasant and Margot Saltonstall and all of their colleagues from Northern Arizona University who provide us with our technology today. Again, as I mentioned, we'll primarily use the chat window and I will monitor your questions and comments, but please feel free to raise your hand if you'd like to use your microphone. And with that, let's get started with today's discussion. So accreditation requirements have been changing in recent years with an increasing focus on student learning outcomes, persistence to graduation, and institutional accountability. Further, student affairs professionals are increasingly being asked to demonstrate and document student learning associated with our student affairs-based programs and services, as well as our learning opportunities during our institutional accreditation processes. This panel discussion will focus on student affairs assessment, outcomes-based assessment efforts, activities, and how the data are collected and used to support the accreditation process, and how student affairs divisions can demonstrate and document compliance with accreditation standards while focusing on accreditation as a means of institutional improvement. As a result of participating in today's conversation, we hope that you will be able to plan and prepare accreditation-related activities, results, and reports in an ongoing yearly basis in preparation for accreditation, identify appropriate data from multiple sources, and develop effective strategies for data collection, analysis, and documentation of compliance with the standards set forth by your regional accrediting body. Develop approaches to working with colleagues that generate buy-in for accreditation as a continuous ongoing process for institutional improvement, and recognize the potential challenges and determine proactive guidelines and procedures to reduce the impact during the accreditation process. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our panel. Dr. Gavin Henning serves as Associate Professor of Higher Education and Director of the Doctorate in Education and Master of Higher Education Administration program for New England College, and he also has experience with NEASC. We also have Dr. Joanne Prosser from the University of Maryland joining us today. She serves as the Director of Research and Assessment for the Department of Residence Life. She has experience working with middle states. We have Dr. Jody Fissler, who works as the Associate for Assessment Policy and Analysis for the State Council of Higher Education for Virginia. And finally, we have Dr. Karen Solomon joining us today. She serves as Vice President for Accreditation Relations for the Higher Learning Commission. So I thank you all for joining us today, and let's get started. Before we start asking questions of our panel, we would like to ask two questions of the audience. Do you currently serve on your institution's accreditation study or leadership or review team or committee? Either yes, no, or if you're not sure your team, or if it's not applicable because you don't have one at this point, that's fine too. But we'd just like to know who might be involved in this process before we get started. And if you could use the multiple choice poll icon, which is the fourth from the left next to the little raise your hand button, that would be great. I see a lot of you have gotten responses in. And I see a lot of you are saying either yes, you're very involved, or no, you're not involved. Oh, and yes, Bob, I see your question about the slides. They will be available after the session. A moment here for folks to respond. All right, so I will go ahead and publish the results now. So yeah, it looks like the majority are not applicable, and the next biggest group is no, I'm not involved. So it looks like a very small percentage of you are involved in your accreditation teams. Our second question we would like to know is, do you serve as a peer reviewer or evaluator for your regional accreditation body? And let me just change our poll really quick to a yes/no. And if you could just indicate whether or not you do that, that would be great. Give a few seconds here. Hi, Darby. I see you just joined us. And George. Hello. Right, I'll go ahead and publish these results in about 10 seconds. And yeah, so we see, yeah, not too many of you are involved as a peer reviewer or evaluator. I've never served myself, but I have learned through colleagues that is a very rewarding endeavor. So I encourage you to look into that. If possibly you might want to serve as a reviewer. It definitely will help you serve your institution. So that's my 2 cents in a little soapbox for participating in the accreditation process. So now we'll turn the discussion over to our panel members. Our first question deals with integrity as we start with the planning process and preparing for accreditation. So panel members, we'd like to hear your thoughts on how you balance the expectation to write to the standard and put the institution's best face forward, while also engaging in an honest and productive self-study process for institutional improvement.
I'll jump in first. So we just had our review a couple of years ago and actually just had a focus visit a couple of weeks ago. And when we started talking about what we wanted to do for our institution, we knew that assessment was an issue. And it had come up before in previous reports, and we knew we needed to do a better job. And so we really were very honest about what we were doing and what we weren't doing. And so it kind of provided an opportunity for us to really get started with this work. And because of that honesty, we were able to leverage resources here at New England College to both create an institutional assessment team, which we did not have before. And now we're looking at spending nearly $50,000 on some technology to help support the assessment process. And I don't think we would not be having these conversations on our campus if we had not really been honest about where we were with assessment and really leverage the opportunity of accreditation to be able to think about how do we actually do a better job and how do we put the resources behind that.
Hi, this is Joanne from University of Maryland. I had the opportunity to participate in Middle State's reaccreditation twice, once almost 10 years ago, once now. So Middle State is actually in the process of revising the accreditation standards, going down from 14 down to 7. And in both times, one of the important aspects that we had was when you're writing your Middle State report, you need to, as a team, come up with recommendations. And so it really behooves you to identify the areas where you need to improve and then write the recommendations so that you have a little bit of control over what they might ask you. Provided that you were upfront, you provide the information. Frequently, as long as there's not a very large deficit, they will usually accept the recommendations that you find. So honesty can often be well rewarded.
Yeah, I would say that in my experience and from what I've heard from people who do reviews for SAC-COC, it's a real red flag if everything in the compliance report is just glowing, and you make the argument that there's nothing that your institution needs to address because it's really just not realistic, and so that does suggest there might be an issue. And one of the worst things to happen is a violation of the integrity principle, which is the very first principle in the SAC-COC standards. So it's really important to remember that this is not a PR document. As much as we do want to put our institution's best face forward, it is important to be very clear about the things that aren't working as well, and then also to talk about the ways in which you're addressing those things. So the final word doesn't have to be something that's not working. It can be about what you're doing as a result of the fact that you recognize that things aren't working.
Karen, did you have anything to add? I heard silence and I had a little bit of a breakup, but I wanted to know if you had anything to add.
I don't have much to add, except to say that in our region, the Higher Learning Commission region, we expect that institutions provide evidence along with that self-study. And so you may write a nice narrative, but if the evidence doesn't support what you've written, then it's going to be challenging for the peer reviewers to understand really where the institution's at.
Well, I think that's a great segue into our next question, unless anyone has additional comments before we move on.
I would just add one thing. One thing that I've seen coming up in listservs is the question about whether institutions should use the accreditation report to advocate for things that they want changed on their institutions. With the idea that if a particular department or a program wants more resources to come to it, that it would be good to play that up in the compliance narrative, and that's generally not seen as a good strategy. You never know if an accrediting body says that recognizes that there's a problem and says that you have to fix it. That's not a guarantee that you're going to like where the resources are redirected from. So it's better to work those things out outside the boundaries of the assessment process.
Thanks, Jody. So we'll move on to our next question that deals with planning and documentation. Hey, Kim, please discuss the importance of assessment plans and how they support accreditation efforts. So associated with this are questions such as, how have you framed your assessment work based on best practices in the field? What types of evidence or documentation are crucial to accreditation efforts? And how is that data gathered, organized, and managed in support of efforts for accreditation?
Hi. So at University of Maryland, there was a strong effort on the academic side of the house to develop plans. Student affairs is notably absent from assessment of learning outcomes, but our division decided that we were going to be proactive in this process, and so we patterned our assessment plan process to look very similar, at least the first time around, with the academic side of the house. So it was articulating what the learning outcomes were, what the data were, and these were direct measures of learning, not necessarily self-report stuff. So we made a decision to mirror what the academic side did. 7 years later, when they were coming back again, and we were participating in the pilot process for the revisions, we found that the original plan structure became a little bit too rigid for us. And so what we did with regards to our plans is we tried to highlight in more of a narrative fashion and less a rigid plan in terms of what it is exactly were our benchmarks in terms of the plan, what evidence we collected, enough information so that it was had face validity in terms of the information, and then what we learned and what we were going to do differently. And so those were the pieces, and we allowed each department that was participating in this to use whatever method worked best for them, but the flexibility seemed to work rather well. The other thing I would note is it really is beneficial if you can put some of this stuff transparently up on the web. That's one of the areas where we're kind of lacking on our campus in terms of student affairs. We had a revision of our student affairs website, and we haven't gotten around to putting all of those reports back up, which makes it a little bit more difficult when you're coming back around. Next.
I'll jump in. I actually conducted a study with the Director of Research for SAC-POC on the reasons why institutions are found to be not in compliance with the institutional effective standards related to student support services. And the things that we found are basically the same things that we talk about in assessment world all of the time. The things that people need to focus on are the basic touch points in the assessment cycle. Are you articulating learning outcomes? Or outcomes, not necessarily learning outcomes. So whatever effectiveness means for that department. Are they articulating the goals and outcomes? Are they sampling in a way that is representative? Are they collecting data that actually gets the information they need to demonstrate their effectiveness? Are they using the results? Is there alignment among those various things? Do the instruments align with the goals? Do the results make sense based on what the findings were? And then is that happening sort of systematically? Is it happening over time? Is it happening across the units within student affairs? Those were all areas where people were getting cited for noncompliance. And it was interesting that there was no one component of that was overwhelmingly more common than any other. There was a pretty reasonable balance where institutions were having trouble with any one of those areas. So it really is important. If you're doing good practice as far as assessment goes, the accreditation pretty much takes care of itself, but not everybody is necessarily doing that assessment in a mature way.
Karen, and I guess I would add that in our criteria, we actually call for institutions to document learning in curricular and co-curricular activities and support the claims that they make. And so some of the assessment information that we see from institutions tends to be more survey-oriented, which is often an indirect measure. So we're looking for a balance of direct and indirect information coming from the institutions, recognizing that there's a plan, that there are goals been set, and there are ways to actually identify whether you're actually meeting those goals in a variety of different circumstances, maybe different departments and divisions that are working together on some common issues, or you could have a project off to the side and one division working on that may also be evidence that you've used to support the claims that students are gaining experience inside and outside of the classrooms.
That was great. I don't have anything to add at this point.
All right, thank you for chiming in on all of that. I do want to backtrack quickly because I see that Alice Mitchell, also from the University of Maryland, has a question that kind of relates more to integrity, but I want to make sure we address her concern. She would like to know if you find that there are conflicting pressures within the institution around putting your best face forward and those opportunities for improvement and how you manage those differing opinions. I think we're going to kind of get to that in a moment, but if you have anything to just kind of share with Alice, that would be great.
Well, we had this issue at a previous institution where the institution really wanted to focus on looking good, but us in student affairs really wanted to focus on how to improve. And so we knew we couldn't, we really weren't at the table for the institutional perspective. So what we tried to do is control as much of what we could do with in the aspect, there's actually one standard for students. So we really tried to control what we could control and focus our work really on the opportunity for improvement rather than just trying to put our best foot forward. And so I think it really depends on how much power or what role individuals have on the team to be able to know how much you can negotiate that or change that a little bit.
Yeah, I would say that one of the better ways to do this is to try to develop some alliances and allies, and then if your voice is at the table, then you have the opportunity to participate. But if your voice is not represented at the table, then it becomes much harder. So even if accreditation is a couple years off, I would start now trying to understand who the players would be and to determine whether or not it's possible to get some student affairs people actually on the working groups that will pull information together. And then you have the opportunity to make a difference or advocate for sort of a different lens.
One of the points I would actually add is that while we're talking about the report that is created and reviewed by the peer reviewers, don't underestimate the opportunity that you have or you may have when the team actually visits the campus, because the interviews and the meetings with different folks across the institution are also very important, and that's where you can talk about what you're doing in terms of improvement and what your timelines are and how those are resourced activities and things like that. So there's also that opportunity to engage formally with the peer reviewers during the process.
Awesome, thank you. With that, we'll move on, and I think we will talk a little bit more about this as our conversation moves forward. Before we move on to our next panel question, though, we have another question for the audience. We'd like to know how you perceive the role of accreditation. Do you see it as a means to improve student learning, to improve institutional practice, or to demonstrate compliance, or maybe all of the above? If you can go and select your answer, that would be great. And I'll give us a few minutes. Feedback. And I see a lot of folks are even chatting, and yep, it's all of the above. All right, I will go ahead and publish these results. So, yeah, most of us do see accreditation as a means to do all three: improve student learning or practice, as well as show our accreditors that we are functioning within the standards that they set forth for us. So we'll move on to our next question. That would be on institutional collaboration. So I think this is where we might see a little bit more insight on Alice's question that she asked. Please discuss the connections between assessment and accreditation, as well as the collaborations between academic affairs and student affairs that occur through accreditation activities. And Joanne, I already have a feeling you'll have a lot to say on this because you already did touch on it. And also, if you have any, please provide some examples of aligning assessment and accreditation between student affairs and academic affairs. I know in my own practice working with many of my colleagues, this has been one of the things that is that challenge, that stumbling block. How do we marry them? So that would be great if you can share a little bit about that with us.
So I would say one of the strategies that we used was we looked at the criteria for accreditation, and we identified the specific areas where we thought student affairs really popped. And so there were a couple standards in, for example, ours that really talked about preparing students for careers and meaningful lives. Also other areas where it wasn't necessarily learning outcomes driven, but they were outcomes related to co-curricular activities. And in those areas, we actually had an advocate, somebody who was part of the steering committee who understood student affairs. She came out of student affairs, and so we were able to have seats at the table. But if you don't have an advocate, then I would say it's very useful to try to develop that in advance of getting to the point where the committees are already aligned. The other thing that was really very useful to us is the first time around when we were looking at learning outcomes assessment related to the Big Five, there was nothing in there really about diversity. And that is most definitely an area in leadership. Those are areas where I think student affairs really excels. And so we tried to highlight, for example, ways in which we were teaching classes in those areas and embedding learning outcomes into those. And so there are very natural places where I think academic affairs and student affairs cross, but sometimes you have to be an advocate for yourself to bring it to the table if that's not a natural alliance already existing on your campus.
Here in New England, we have a structural challenge in our standards because there's actually one standard just for students. So there's not this integrated set of standards like there are for other accrediting organizations. So in some ways, we're already set apart just because of the standards. And even the student standard focuses on admissions, graduation rates, retention, and really pretty much student services, not even student affairs. There's no mention of learning in that standard. So there's a structural challenge that we have, but here at New England College, we're small. So we have about 1,200 undergrads, and so we're actually to be able to have a lot of collaboration because we're small. and we're a teaching institution, so there is this this natural inclination to work together collaboratively to help students. So we definitely have a benefit because of our size, but we have a challenge with the standards itself. But like Joanna said before, I think the key is finding allies in the academic side. Fortunately, I'm on the academic side now, so I can help tell the story of student affairs and why it's important in our assessment accreditation efforts, but it's really helpful to get those folks that can be really be allies and advocates for you on the academic side.
I think it's good to remember that there are ways in which student affairs assessment is different from academic assessment, and to honor the way that those things are different. I mean, at least with that COC, it's absolutely possible to bring those differences out, and it doesn't conflict with anything else that the institution might be writing in its compliance narrative. You know, I had the good fortune when I was the director of assessment for student affairs at William & Mary to have a really good relationship with the director of institutional effectiveness and accreditation. So, you know, we talked a lot throughout, just in the course of regular work. But I sat on the university assessment committee, and we talked a lot about the accreditation efforts as well. When the institution first started preparing for the reaffirmation review, the academic departments were given a particular template to guide their plans for institutional effectiveness, which is what they were called there. And I made the mistake of trying to take that template and apply it to student affairs departments, and that didn't actually go over very well. And we learned pretty quickly that the language that was being used on the academic side, even though it was all assessments and the basic building blocks were the same, it was really a barrier to some of the student affairs folks. So we had to do some work to adapt that template to make it more meaningful for student affairs. And we were successful in actually presenting something that the reviewers found to be satisfactory. So I think it was just important that we recognized that student affairs was student affairs, and it wasn't necessarily the same kind of experience and couldn't be reported in exactly the same way that the academic departments were reporting out on their results.
I think there's one thing to consider, and if you thought about the institution, you think about program outcomes and assessing programs at the institution, but are you aware if your institution has institutional outcomes, sort of broad learning outcomes across all of the programs, and actually student affairs? So for example, many institutions may have outcomes related to critical thinking and effective communication. So how do you weave some of those institutional outcomes into the work that you do across the various student affairs divisions at your institution? Being able to actually see what those outcomes are, understand what's being measured in those, and actually stepping up to the plate and saying, we'd like to work on that also, can be a way to sort of build that collaboration between student affairs and academic affairs.
One other thing I might add is sometimes the academic side of the house has more resources to devote to this. So, for example, when they were bringing consultants to campus, because we had an advocate on the planning committee, student affairs folks were invited to the table to participate in the all-day trainings, to listen to the consultants. So if there's a way for you to align, you might be able to garner or leverage some additional resources for student affairs assessment in this area.
Well, thank you all for your advice and experience on that. I do know at previous institutions I worked with, there was kind of that disconnect and having a student affairs representative at the table. So I also appreciated the Karen, it seems to be that you're indicating be proactive. Look at those institutional outcomes and begin that alignment. But yeah, I like the idea of also being proactive to kind of get at that table. Maybe we should wait for an invitation and more volunteer. But with that, we'll move on unless there are further comments or questions.
Actually, Mary Lee, I'll make a comment, and that is, I think knowing what the institutional outcomes are may actually be very helpful for student affairs divisions, because it can help frame what you as your division needs to work on and give some clarity for where the institution's moving to. Also, taking a look at the strategic plan and being aware and familiar with what's set out in the strategic plan, and then asking each of the departments, how can we contribute to the institution's strategic plan to move the institution going forward? And I think there's some documents and resources that institutions pretty naturally build that student affairs aren't necessarily using to their benefit to help sort of frame some future direction for the division.
Do you think that might be because maybe student affairs professionals might not realize it would be helpful? Like, why do you think that is? I'm just curious.
I think that's actually, I think you're on a really good point there. Quite often, student affairs, as we've already indicated here, are sort of set off to the side in many ways at institutions. And you just need to figure out how to build that pathway to be sort of front and center or side by side with some of the other divisions at the institution, and becoming aware of where some of the real institutional long-term goals are. I think helps shake out some of the activities that you may be focusing on that really don't help lead to where the institution has its goals set. And also, for some of the student affairs programs, they don't talk about strategic planning in some of the academic programs. And so how do we start to build a new group of professionals coming through that understand institutional mission, institutional learning goals, strategic plans, and things like that can be very, very helpful. We look to institutions to have plans and to have goals for those plans and evidence that they were working towards those goals. And be able to have that as a framework and then build off of what's already been set out there for the institution can be really helpful.
I think that's a really good example of something that accreditation has probably encouraged institutions to do or student affairs departments to think about. Ideally, we wouldn't need accreditation to make us do that because it's just a good thing to do. If the institution is about achieving certain types of outcomes for students, then you'd like to think that everybody at the institution would be trying to align the work that they do with those goals. And I realize it doesn't always happen. But again, I think that's an interesting situation where accreditation sort of makes people look at the way they're doing their work and maybe rethink it and to align those things with better practices, better principles.
Yeah, I just want to share that Bob says, amen, Karen. Aligning with institutional outcomes in our strategic plan is essential. So, what better way is there to dissolve that line of demarcation? That's a great point. And I'm actually reading a book chapter on this very topic right now. So it's just so funny. It's like, wow, I was just reading that this morning. So we'll move on to the next question, unless there's any I just want to make sure the audience, no one has any questions. So let's move on to our next topic. That would be overcoming challenges, and I'm sure anyone who has been involved in the accreditation process, challenges are probably commonplace. If there's someone that's never encountered one, I'd love to know who you are. So when it comes to overcoming challenges during the process, can you discuss some examples of challenges and the types of challenges that are encountered during the self-study and what you do when you have unexpected findings? How do you address them?
Why is it coming to me first? All right. I would say that this is a great question. The reality is that there will be a long list of challenges and a long list of unexpected findings. And so it is true that you have to, this goes back to our first question, how do you balance those kinds of things? And I think that you have to pick through those challenges and figure out where you're going to put the energy. Where you're going to put the energy in terms of aligning in order to do the self-study. But here's where I would say that if you have done a good job on your campus, laying the groundwork that this is an opportunity as opposed to a punitive process, then you have a little bit less resistance, I think, in terms of framing the recommendations and using it as an opportunity in order to make change.
One of the challenges I've had actually in a couple different campuses where I've assisted with the process was the lack of data. because the assessment systems had not been developed. They weren't in a planning process. And so we got to the point we had to do our self-study, and we really didn't have a lot of data. So that was really a challenge. We tried to figure out how do we actually go out and collect data. Again, some of the planning process didn't start as early as what I thought it should, and so there was some scrambling around to get it. The latest example, we didn't have a lot of data to present, and so I think that was a shortcoming of our study because we didn't have a lot of data. But I think we're able to leverage that when we talked about recommendations, what we wanted to do around assessment, that we haven't done a lot, and so we need to do a lot. And so we put some ideas and some concepts into the recommendations that I think were really helpful to be able to hold us accountable, because NASC was going to come back and ask us in a couple of years, which they just did a couple of weeks ago, where are we on our assessment? And so I think that was one of the big challenges I've come against. So we have to think about how do you actually build in a process that you have continual amounts of data, and also be thinking about what story do you want to tell, and how do you gather that data from year to year so you can be able to tell that story as fully as possible.
I would agree with what Gavin just said. I think it's really important to have a process. It's an ongoing process. I think sometimes there's a sense that when the reaffirmation process is over, everyone can just kind of kick back and say, "It's good, we don't have to think about that for another, 5 years, 7 years, whatever it is." And that's probably not the best way to go about it, because I think the review teams really do like to see evidence of mature processes where you're reassessing things after having made changes, so you can see whether or not the changes you've made actually resulted in improvements. And you can't do that if you're scrambling at the last minute to try to find data where there is none. So putting those processes in place where you are collecting data on an ongoing basis and taking a look at it and seeing how it aligns with the goals and the expectations of the institution, all of that is so important.
And you could find a variety of different things as you're working on the self-study or in the years leading up to starting to write and work on the self-study. But it may be that you find that you've realized that there's some issues. Maybe you've gotten some results back from student surveys, or you've launched some events that have been unexpectedly, underwhelmingly having students participate in those activities. It's time for you to step back and say, okay, what's working well, what's not working well, and then redefine, readjust, and move forward. Or in some cases, it may be that you need to wind down and conclude some programming or things like that you're finding that you're not receiving the results. That ongoing evaluation structure is what our peer reviewers are looking for. How does the institution continually evaluate what it's working towards, not just for assessment of student learning, but even to think about your facilities, some of your resources, different support mechanisms, and things like that. How do you evaluate those? And that's part of the criteria for accreditation, is asking how, as an institution, do you evaluate even your assessment activities, not just assessing how students are learning, whether they're expecting to learn, but is the process that you're using actually working for the institution, or does it itself need to be redefined?
Yeah, I would echo that. The other thing you want to do is make sure that you can document that. So, and on our campus a couple years ago, all of our departments have to submit an annual report to the VP's office, and then they go and have a meeting about it. And so a number of years ago, they added a section specifically around assessment and learning outcomes that is part of our annual report. These are in addition to summary reports that every department generates around their activities. This actually goes into our very large report. And so having that in there is evidence of the importance of assessment. And it's not really what you found, it's really what you did about it, right? So you have to briefly describe what it is, what you learned, and then how you actually use the assessment. So if there's an opportunity for you to embed that into a regular structure, then you can demonstrate to accreditors that this is really important and you're really using data to inform decision making.
I think one of the key terms to keep in mind when you're thinking about accreditation is that we're looking for institutions that are continuously improving. So what are your practices for continuous improvement, and how can you think about documenting that? One final comment that I would make is think about gathering that information on a regular basis. Student affairs tend to have a lot of people that move quickly through an institution and go on to other careers or other institutions and things like that. So it's going to be critical that you have a plan and a strategy for gathering information on a regular basis. Otherwise it will be lost, and there's been some really good work that's been done, but you haven't captured that. In our region, we actually provide a web-based technology platform for our institutions to build not only their argument of how they meet the criteria, but also to store evidence. And if you're in the Higher Learning region, Higher Learning Commission region, we're a 19-state region, you may want to become familiar with that, because that evidence file can be where you can post some of those documents that you may find would be helpful, make the case of how you meet the criteria for accreditation. So if you haven't been involved, you may want to ask around about who in your campus actually works with that evidence file, and it may become your sort of accreditation library, and maybe have folders built in there if you don't already have something on your own campus.
Thank you for sharing that. As someone who has assisted with the accreditation process for middle states, and Gavin talked a little bit about lack of data, I know in my most recent position, our problem wasn't so much lack of data, but rather the organization of it. And a lot of it was actually kept on paper and not electronic, which was a challenge for us. So we had to figure out a way, not only to format it in a way that we could share it with middle states. So Karen, you touched on, I guess, the fleeting nature of student affairs and how folks come and go. And I like that you touch on that continuity of process. So it seems like it's important to have a solution of kind of passing on that torch and not losing that institutional history in the process, and kind of figuring out a best way to do that, because you're right, if that knowledge leaves the institution, even if the data is there, without that context, it can kind of be difficult to kind of figure out what it is, right?
Absolutely, and I think this is an opportunity for you to think about how do you provide some professional development activities for the staff within your division, and maybe that accreditation isn't something that just happens once every 10 years, but the elements of the criteria, the standards, depending on whichever region you're in, they're just common activities that any strong institution should be following. And so it may be an opportunity for you actually to have ongoing conversations about accreditation and the key elements of what the criteria standards are and how you measure yourself against that. That becomes a way for you to keep engaging staff in those conversations and have them bring up issues and things like that. So it's not just an activity that compliance activity or things like that, but it actually can be professional development for your staff, and so they are bringing information to the pipeline instead of having to go out and search for it all the time.
Yeah, that's a great point. As someone who had to assist in the searching for documentation and evidence, we definitely came up with some recommendations on how we're going to handle that in the future. So with that, unless there's further questions from the audience or further comments, we'll move to our final panel question. All right. So finally, utilizing findings, and if there's anything I've heard a lot in student affairs assessment and accreditation in general at times is, we have all this data, we haven't used it, we don't know what to do with it. So utilizing those findings, it's not a problem everywhere, but sometimes it is a problem in terms of showing how we used our evidence to make adjustments, improvements, create new programs and services. So can you please share some successful strategies for planning and utilizing findings? And I think planning is key. I think if we plan to use them, they'll get used. So how can we plan to use and use those findings from peer evaluators? And I'll also say our own team reports, our own recommendations. So what kind of changes will you make? How you will develop the plans for the changes, and how you even document those changes and share those results. So if we could talk a little bit about that. And Joanne, I would love to hear a little bit more about sharing on the web, because you did kind of mention that, and I wonder if that may come into play here with this topic.
Sure.
You don't have to go first, though.
It's okay. So I would say that yes, there are the recommendations from the accreditation process, but hopefully you're already doing assessment on a regular basis and identifying areas that you want to improve. And so you're kind of just cherry picking those things and adding them into the peer review process. So in an ideal world, ideally this is already part of your practice. On our campus, we do not have a centralized person that is in the role for assessment for the division. We have an assistant VP who chairs a working group, a committee, with representatives from different departments across the campus that is charged with pushing forward assessment efforts on campus. And so it was that committee that came up with the structure of summary reports that every committee reports out on, and then our AVP advocated to include in the annual reports from each department to the VP's office the additional note. It's like a half a page of the report. Bringing it honestly to that level meant that there's some kind of accountability, because let's be honest, if there's not some kind of accountability, often it's a little bit hard to focus on adding that assessment onto everything else that everybody else has to do, especially if there's not dedicated lines or even partial lines to the assessment process.
When I actually work with some of the institutions, I talk about a timeline for an accreditation review, and folks really tend to focus on that front end, building the report, preparing for the team to come and visit and things like that, and they sort of all go, oh good, glad it's over, as the peer reviewers are driving away. But when I start talking about the timeline, I encourage folks to think about it in a much more expansive way, thinking about the report as one piece, the institution's report, thinking about the peer reviewers report as a second piece, going through the final decision-making process that your regional accrediting agency has to follow. And then the fourth piece actually being taking that information, both the institution's report and the peer reviewers report, and going through it, digging through it, identifying what are the next steps you need to work on, seeing where the peer reviewers actually complimented the institution on some of the work that they've been doing. And that's, people are always astonished to think about compliments coming through a report, but it's usually a balanced report. There's recognition of what the institution's doing well, and there are opportunities for improvement. But you need to take some time and actually think about that. What are we doing well? What do we really want to, give ourselves a pat on the back for, because we're accomplishing some really good things here, and also to look at the opportunities for improvement going into the future.
I just want to say I love your point about reviewing the positive recommendations. I think so many people view accreditation as a scary process and whether or not we're compliant, and I think we often fail to realize that, first of all, they're not out to get us, but they do have good things to say about what we're doing great, and we need to pay just as much attention to what we're doing awesome and we're doing well, just as much as what we need to improve. If there's anything demotivating, it's not having a bright spot. So I really appreciate you conveying that, yes, the accreditors aren't just all about fixing an improvement. They do have positive things to say about a lot of areas of our institution. Anyone else have comments? Okay, if we don't have any more comments on utilizing findings, I just want to make sure I'm also not having a computer glitch right now. I wanted to give it a moment. Seems a lot of us are having technical problems today.
Thanks, Marilee. Let's talk a little bit about what are some of the issues that are out on the horizon that you may need to be aware of. And the first one of all is that accreditation actually is a national conversation now. We've just gone through a presidential election campaign where candidates were actually talking about accreditation. And for our office, that was a pretty big shift. We haven't really seen presidential elections where they're talking about accreditation. And there are concerns about how accreditation takes place. The lack of transparency in some situations and things like that. So many of our public institutions will post their peer reviewer reports on their website. They know they're going to receive FOIA requests for it and things like that. Many of our public institutions keep that information pretty private. At this point in time, our region does not publish the full team report, but there have been conversations about whether it's a full team report or if it's sort of an annotated version that's more for the public understanding, because the language in the reports tends to be peer reviewer to institution, and so it's that inside language that tends to be a bit difficult. But there's a lot more call for transparency in the accreditation process, and so I think you'll see over the next several years some changes being made as far as that goes. Also, there's a push for completion. We've increased the amount of financial aid we're giving out as a country, but the completion rate isn't also rising in the same way that the funding is. And so there is a much heavier push on completion than there has been before. And this is where we talk about persistence, retention, and completion, and what is success. And that's one of the biggest challenges with our federal financial aid structure. Students are expected to declare that they're a degree-seeking student, whereas some of them actually may only be coming to the institution for a handful of classes, and that will suffice for what they need to move ahead, whether it's in a career or personal life or things like that. But we are working with all of the other regional agencies in a national project this fall, going out to institutions that have very low graduation rates and asking them, what are you going to do about it? What goals do you have? Are they reasonable? Are they feasible? What resources are you going to put towards it? And how do you know that the strategy that you set forth is going to be realistic? I don't know if any of you read the Inside Higher Ed this morning, but there's even conversations in there today about the fact that the high school graduation rate is high school graduates is really going to stagnate, and the amount of students that will be available even to move into the college pipeline is going to be drawing down quite a bit. And so how are you going to preserve, maintain a relationship with the students that you recruit into the institution, helping them to be successful for what their success goals are? And then how do you capture that as success, not just a graduation and earning of a degree, but there may be other smaller micro-credentials that the institution may be considering or looking at and things like that. The national study we're looking at the institutions with low performance, was going to raise a lot of conversations and questions about the whole concept of access. And that will be another national discussion about open admissions institutions and access for different student populations and things like that. And it deserves to be a strong national conversation. We are not meeting the needs of students. A lot are sitting out with most of the degree completed, but still a ways to go to complete that degree. They're being held back by not having some of that education to be able to prove to employers that they can take on some of the different jobs and things like that. So the time is right. There's going to be a lot of conversation going forward about accreditation and about completion. And some of that may be even in the reauthorization legislation that will probably now start to pick up language about that in the process now that we're past the election and things like that. So the reauthorization legislation calls into Accreditors require different types of activities or different types of approvals or things like that. It always changes a little bit as we move forward. So it'll be interesting to see what this reauthorization cycle looks like as far as that goes. The other thing I wanted to comment about is that the U.S. Department of Education is very involved in some experimental programs. And those experimental programs may or may not tap into your institutions. There's one experimental program that's going on right now with institutions that are awarding degrees based on competencies earned. They may be competencies linked to credit hours, or they may actually be just competencies, and the fulfillment of all those competencies leads to a degree. When it's just competencies based, it's called direct assessment. When those competencies are wrapped into credit hours and awarded in that way, it's called competency-based education. What's interesting about that is that some of the work in student affairs and the activities that students are involved in maybe in the clubs or organizations or leadership activities or things like that, may actually be part of the information that they can use, students can use as they build their portfolio. So you may have more ties to academic affairs than you maybe thought you would have going forward. So it's an opportunity, if your institution's talking about competency-based education in any way, get into the conversation, find out what's going on, because it may be impactful for many different areas of your institution. That's one of the 3 initiatives. The second initiative is when the institution is engaged with a contractor, another vendor, and that vendor or contractor is actually providing education for the institution. And that is a different type of program. It's got a small group of institutions in there, but it's allowing different type of vendors to deliver education instead of just the institution. That could have far-reaching impacts. If the experiment is successful, it'll mean there are more players out there vying for students than we've ever seen before. And in this experiment, those vendors are, and the students that take classes through those vendors are now eligible for federal financial aid. So there may be a shift in who is actually delivering education for students, not just institutions as we all know it to traditionally be, but there may also be some new players in there. There may be new opportunities for student affairs when that or if that occurs on a much broader scale. The third initiative is very interesting, and that is where the program allows institutions that have been accepted into this experiment to actually award Pell aid to high school students that are enrolled in dual credit. Think about that, high school students earning, receiving Pell grant money and earning credits that someday, if they move into an institution and are enrolled in an institution, those credits may or may not actually apply towards a degree of study. So it may be that we start to see a different population of students that are already starting to work through some of their Pell money and things like that before they've even entered your institution. Could have some interesting consequences for institutions going forward. So those are some of the 3 activities that are taking place outside of the standard U.S. Department of Education activities, and this is their experimental program piece. So stay tuned. As you're reading about things, keep your eye out for those 3 activities and talk about them within your division, because I think there will be some areas that are touched by those different types of activities, especially if they prove to be successful and are launched on a much broader basis here in the country.
Well, thank you for sharing, Karen. I was actually taking some notes on what you were saying. Yeah, you're right. When you think about it, it's kind of like increased competition for customers. So how do we get them is kind of what I'm getting. And also the point about the third-party vendors, which I know from my experience on middle states, just in terms of reporting and sharing who those vendors are, I haven't been personally involved in an institution that's using one. But I could see how that is becoming a trend because I know that there are other institutions doing that. Do we have any questions or comments? Just looking to see if anyone.
And while you're looking, Mary Leah, I would also comment on the fact that dual credit students is a growing population here in the country. So we've got students that are still in high school. They're taking college credit and earning college credit, and also it applies towards their high school graduation requirements in many cases. And these are students that may be high-performing academically. They may also be students that are most at risk at the high schools. But our expectation is that in this region is that whatever students are enrolled through an institution, you have support services and mechanisms and resources appropriate for all of the students. And so it's interesting, I don't know how many student affairs divisions at institutions are really thinking about the dual credit population. We've got one state in our region that actually allows 7th and 8th graders to take dual credit classes and have even had those students on their campuses. Now you've got some home risk management issues to consider. So there is a real shift in the environment in terms of who's delivering education and also who are the students that are actually receiving the education. Could be some interesting conversations back at the institution.
I think we can do a whole structured conversation on just the future, right, Karen?
Absolutely.
Right, I'm just looking at our chat to see if we have any questions or comments. Nothing this far. Any input from other panel members before we move on to audience questions and questions submitted through the registration process? And thank you, Kelly. I'm glad you enjoyed it. All right. I just want to go over some questions that were submitted along with registration, although I think we've probably addressed most of them. I tried to map them out a little bit. So 2 questions seem to kind of go along with our third topic of institutional collaboration. So that's co-curricular assessment, how it can be used to support the accreditation process. And also a second question on how to make the case for involving student affairs staff with institutional accreditation activities, both to potential staff representatives and those beyond student affairs. I'm just curious if there are any further questions related to this topic or anything we might have missed.
Really, the only thing I would just add is the importance of telling the story of student affairs, because that's, I mean, assessment can help us do that, but I think the other key piece is the better job we do telling our story, the more the rest of the institution will see the benefit and see what we add to the institutional experience for students and student learning. So I think the better job we can do telling our story as a division, I think the more we're going to be invited to the table for these bigger conversations.
I might also add, this is an opportunity, I think, for student affairs to see where your missions are well aligned with the strategic mission of your campus. And identifying and highlighting those are definitely ways in which to bridge the gap and to provide information. Usually there's something in most, I would say, strategic plans or missions for a university to educate, global citizens or students who will contribute to society, those kinds of statements, and most definitely student affairs is well positioned to contribute to those types of goals. The other thing is if career services is located within student affairs on your campus, that's another really important place where you definitely want to be gathering good data about where your students, in terms of the employment rates of them and where they're located. Those kinds of things are really, really important in terms of contributing to just the overall effectiveness of the institution.
And then we also had a question about documenting compliance. And Karen, this was kind of actually directed for you. I think you covered everything here, but I just want to check in and see if there's anything you have to add with regards to documenting compliance. So our participant wondered, what if Student Affairs lacks division-wide learning outcomes, but our institution has them, and a strategic plan that identifies key metrics. So this person would like to know what recommendations do you have for student affairs to prepare for an HLC visit, and what are some best practices? Like I said, I think you kind of touched on this, but I just wanted to see if you have anything else to add with regard to this question.
Sure, thanks, Marilee. I think what's really interesting here is that we did touch about on the issue of institutional outcomes and expectations, but at your own institutions, who identifies what the persistence and completion rates are? And what department, what group actually pulls that together? Do you have a seat at the table or someone within your division actually talking and working through that? And in some cases, that's not the case with student affairs being involved. But that's really important to be able to have that foot in the door and sitting at the table to determine what not only the rates will be, but what are the strategies that you're going to need to accomplish in order to meet those expectations? And completion is one of the hot topics across the country right now, and it's only going to grow. So if you're not involved or your division is not involved at the institution, I think now's the time for you to start to make the plea to be sitting at the table in that conversation. What's interesting is that quite often our institutions will have goals set, and they won't be able to articulate the process that was used to set those goals, such as completion rates, or won't be able to articulate across different groups of the institution how they plan to accomplish that. So, for example, you may have some pretty significant retention and persistence goals. Well, how does that play into your orientation processes? And is your orientation something that just occurs a few days before school starts? Is there any follow-up throughout the year, and even at the end of the year before students leave, after finals, before finals are completed, to sort of gauge, re-engage with students in some different types of ways? How are you thinking about those types of activities, carrying it forward on a regularized basis? Thinking about how you identify some student learning that may be taking place in the residence halls about communicating and living in a very diverse community. And how does that information feed back into information about how the student is preparing, how the institution, is preparing students to live in a global, live and work in a global environment. Bringing that information back in where folks may not have anticipated to get some of that information. That's where we see some good practice emerge from our institutions. We also see that more and more of our institutions are using what they call as academic coaches, and these may be folks that are in the academic affairs side of the house, but they may also be student affairs side of the house. And these are people that are assertive, checking in with students, if not every term, maybe every few weeks, reminding them about key times within the institutional calendar, about when it's time to register for classes, how are things going, and things like that. We're seeing more and more attention being given to helping students move through processes at the institution and not passively waiting for the student to arrive at an office, but to actually step forward and make sure that the student has what they need, has the information that they need, and knows where to go if they have some additional concerns or issues that they need to have addressed. So documenting compliance can be through meeting minutes. It can be through annual reports that are submitted, as was mentioned earlier in the session here. And so that information are static documents. It's what you do and how you analyze it and set a plan going forward is the real piece that we really want to see. It's not just, oh, here are the meeting minutes we met regularly. Well, what are some of the key issues that are emerging in those meetings? How have you analyzed that and set a plan moving forward? So to just take that next step is what we find that is really some of the best practice at some of our institutions.
Thank you. And I just want to mention, I know she's not here, but Jody Fissler unfortunately had to leave. She is actually traveling back from the Southern Association Accreditation Conference right now, so she didn't want to be rude and interrupt, but thank you very much, Dr. Fissler, for joining us. I just wanted to let everyone know that's why she's not here anymore. Moving on to, we had two other questions submitted through registration, and I'm thinking I want to just look at question 5 first, I think, because I think this also relates to documenting compliance. It's about student archives of student work, which make sense for class settings. But the participant here is just not sure how archives of student work might apply for student affairs. So I wonder if any of you have any experience with archives of student work and how you work with them, how it applies, how that relates to documentation, anything about those archives. And I think here maybe we can even touch a little bit on maybe student portfolios, e-portfolios, things of that nature.
I'm not used to using it. We have not used it on the campus I've been in, but I've heard of people using both portfolios for learning across the curriculum. I think the University of Michigan has done that using the LEAP outcomes. Actually, I think there are a number of other institutions that use the LEAP learning outcomes and then actually gather data across the curriculum and co-curricular experiences. And I've also heard some portfolios around leadership development, so which is kind of similar to this idea of a co-curricular transcript, but they're actually documents and artifacts that demonstrate what students learn, not just the activities they've been part of. But I don't have direct experience with that.
Yeah, we've had some conversations about co-curricular portfolios, but we have not pulled them together either.
Right, unfortunately, I wish Jody was here to chime in, but maybe I'll even ask her if she has any input on this, and we can share that when the link and the PowerPoints go out. Finally, we have the other submitted question. I think goes goes well with panel question 4 with overcoming challenges. So our participant mentioned that student affairs programs articulate learning outcomes that require more in-depth and multiple learning opportunities, often than one our programs can offer. And then we have issues of less structured programs, voluntary participation. Additionally, common indicators such as time to degree and persistence are a result of multiple factors. And defining reasonable and accurate scope and depth of degree, we're hearing more about these archives, so kind of going in there again. Any help in, I'm trying to, it's more of a comment, but and I'm trying to put it more in question form, but just how to deal with the assessment practices when we have all these multiple learning opportunities. We have situations where students aren't required to be participating. So any additional insight on this comment/question that was that kind of maps to challenges would be helpful for the person who asked it, I think.
Well, I can provide, I think, a little bit of guidance. In terms of some of the learning that takes place over a long period of time, which we may not even realize while the students are on our campuses, the suggestion I usually have to folks is, what do you expect to see along that way? So if you think about learning as a progression, and really the goal may be lifelong learning, and well, what are we going to do? How are we going to measure that? We can't really necessarily do lifelong learning, measure that on our campuses, but what would be some of the behaviors we'd expect a student to have if they're on the road to lifelong learning? And then you can assess those behaviors and those outcomes. And then in regard to time to degree and persistence and graduation rates, the conversation we're having on our campus right now is trying to identify and assess around the items that are identified in theory. And so right now we're using John Braxton's work and his theory for persistence on residential campuses. And so we're actually trying to assess the behaviors in the different parts of that theory to be able to connect that, to be able to demonstrate, at least in the student affairs area, how are they contributing to persistence, because it's the entire collegiate experience, but can they actually be able to isolate the work that they're doing on specific elements within the theory?
I'm going to answer this in a bit of a roundabout way. So I would say that when you're starting to do your assessments for the influence of student affairs around student learning, I think there are kind of two main ways that you could approach this. You could use You could define them for the division and then require each of the departments to identify how they contribute this, a bit of a mapping exercise where you indicate all the different areas and the ways in which you're contributing to these global learning objectives that were articulated or defined by the division in general. Or you could allow each individual department to identify what is most important to them. And so I think one of the more challenging things around learning outcomes assessment is really continuation of this effort, right? So often it starts because of accreditation. People get geared up, they start doing it, but to continue that is very, very challenging. And so here's where I would say understanding the culture of your campus is really, really critical, and then picking up an approach that you really think is going to have legs over time is going to be helpful. Sometimes this approach of trying to develop something very, very large might be a little overwhelming, especially if assessment doesn't have a lot of resources dedicated to it on your campus, meaning there aren't people that are specifically designated to the assessment role, and what you're doing, in fact, is actually adding assessment on top of people's normal workload. So I would say a strategy for success is to understand the culture and then pick an approach that you think is going to have longevity on your campus.
I would also add that keep it simple. You don't need to evaluate every single thing that the students are involved or engaged in, but you may want to ask yourself, what's the research that we really want to study in this division? Come up with that question and figure out whether that pervades across the entire division or some departments within the division, and then go ahead and go out and really study it. Many of our institutions do a lot of work of just trying to gather as much information as possible, but not really asking what's the question that we want to know about. For example, our students that are involved in the clubs and organizations and Greek life and things like that, how are they in terms of articulating in oral presentations, and how does that compare to other students at the institution? Actually seeing it, their out-of-classroom activities makes them a stronger student in some of their different courses and things like that. What is that question that you really want to ask and have research on, instead of just gathering a lot of information that doesn't connect together?
Thank you. And Karen, thank you all for also for kind of directing us and giving a little bit of advice, because that's another thing that I have encountered and discussed with colleagues. How much is too much? How much is too little? So yeah, really trying to help us determine where to focus our assessment and not assess everything. I definitely have been in a situation where folks feel this accreditation like it's on their backs, and they feel like they have to provide every piece of evidence and really speak to everything. And first of all, it's not always possible. So just like you said, really researching those things that are important to us and whittling it down and creating that focus, I think is really helpful for a lot of us to hear. So we have 4 minutes left in our session today. Does anyone, I chatted out, but does anyone have any additional questions or comments for our panel today before we close?
Mary Lee, while folks are actually typing in their last questions frantically, I'd like to give one piece of advice, and that is to stop and actually do an audit of all the different ways you're assessing student learning. Pull that information together and then identify which are the activities that are yielding a lot of good information or that people even use, and consider stopping doing some of the activities that you may be doing right now that you don't ever use. It's more busy work and it just gets put on the shelf. Really identify those activities that bring value to the Student Affairs Division, and use those and expand on those, whether it's different populations or modified in some different ways. But try to get away from just doing everything just to do it, and actually really focus it in on those that are giving you quality information that's usable.
Right. Work smarter, not harder, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, so I do not see any additional questions or comments. I have to say thank you all. You were very thorough in answering questions. You've left me with very few questions, if any. Any questions I would have would be help. I'm in the middle of accreditation process right now. That being said, I want to thank you all. Thank you to Dr. Jody Fisler, Dr. Karen Solomon, Dr. Gavin Henning, and Dr. Joanne Prosser for joining us today to share about their experiences with accreditation. I think it's also a timely discussion considering a lot of folks are at their regional accreditation conferences this week, last week, next week. So I hope that if you are able to attend one of your regional conferences, you're able to gather some information, especially for those of us in student affairs that often feel like we're left out of the table and we're not quite sure what to do. And Gavin, thank you for sharing the monograph. I will make sure that that gets sent out along with our resources. With that, I just want to draw your attention to a few things that I did provide, and I will add more to our slides when they go out. So we have access to accreditation in the role of the Student Affairs Student Affairs Educator PDF, as well as links to Middle States, New England Association of Schools and Colleges, the Southern Association, as well as the Higher Learning Commission for more information on your region. We want to thank you all for joining us today. If you have any additional questions, please feel free to send them to me or other members of the Professional Development Committee, and we will work hard to get these accreditation resources out to you. Because like Karen mentioned, this is becoming a national conversation, and here on the PDC, we want to make sure that you're prepared in advance for accreditation efforts as a student affairs professional. Even if you're not part of the accreditation team, there's still a lot we can bring to the table. Finally, I wanted to let you all know this is our last structured conversation for 2016. We are already planning our dates for 2017, so please keep an eye on the listserv. We should have an announcement about that at the end of the month. In the meantime, we can confirm that our next structured conversation will be a partnership with Campus Labs, so mark your calendars for January 25th at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. We'll have that information most likely in the wrap-up at the end of the month as well. So we thank you again for joining us today. Please feel free to keep the conversation going. Email us if you have questions, and have a great day.